In today's video, we're going to talk about ways that you could reset your playing. Whenever something new happens, whether you make a lot of progress on the instrument, or even you get a new violin, like I have here, I think these are opportunities for a sort of reset, a sort of recalibration, a second chance, perhaps. For me, that catalyst is a recent loan that I received from the wonderful people at Carriage Violins in Boston. I'm absolutely honored to be playing on this violin made by Antonio Stradivari in 1714. So this is Stradivari's golden period, as they say. And this violin actually belonged to Franz Kneisel, who was the founder of the Kniesel Quartet, which is based here in Boston. The Kneisel Quartet was the first professional quartet in the United States. In fact, the American quartet of Dvorak, the world premiere was done on this violin by the Kneisel Quartet. And Franz Kneisel was also a friend of Brahms, and in America the quartet premiered works such as the Debussy Quartet, the Ravel Quartet, and even Schoenberg's Verklagte. So again, I want to thank Carriage House Violins, Rob Mays, Yunhee Lee, Daniel Lelchik, all the wonderful people there. If you want to support this channel, I encourage you to go to my Patreon, where I'm making all sorts of videos that you won't find on YouTube. And 2 times a month we do a group Zoom call where anyone can ask questions, chat about any topics, or play for the group and get feedback. I'm going to break this up into a few sections. So first we're going to talk about intonation and kind of the aural recalibration that you can do. Next, I'm going to talk about physical techniques and your interaction with the instrument. So everything from bow technique, sound production, chord playing. So part of this video will be kind of a guide for how to quickly get used to a new instrument, but also this video will serve as a guide to perhaps resetting aspects of your technique when you do have that catalytic change in your life. So for any given note, I like to think about how it sounds, how it feels, and how it looks. Talking about how a note sounds, let's talk about intonation and more specifically how you hear overtones and how you hear the slight changes in pitch on any individual note. One of the things that I noticed with this instrument is that the measurement between the bridge and the nut, which is the length of the vibrating string, is actually different from my personal violin. So while this isn't a big change, this in combination with how the instrument resonates differently and sounds differently under the ear, it makes intonation feel different. So this is an interesting opportunity for me to kind of reassess how I hear certain intervals and what being in tune sounds like. I would play a slow scale and I would kind of feel how each note resonates, how it excites other strings, how it excites certain modes of vibration on the instrument, certain overtones. For example, even just this A, finding the right place for this A. This instrument will sound a certain way. Every instrument will be different. So of course I can tune with the open D. You could tell it was already in tune before I did that because I was listening for the sympathetic vibration of the A string. So the instrument kind of gets excited when I play A's, D's, G's, E's, and so on. So there's a lot of intonation work you can do just by going through this slow process. So I'm seeing how the resonance changes under my ear and kind of in my head, these vibrations, how it changes when, let's say, this D is here versus... And sometimes the changes are so small that the pitch itself isn't drastically different, but the overtones and the vibrations will be drastically different. So I think this is an overlooked method of working on your intonation. A lot of people know about, checking with open strings and even more advanced things like listening for beat frequencies. The major third should be lower in a double stop and so on. So I think this way challenges you a bit more. You have less of an immediate reference and you're more going by feel. And I find this is a great way to get to know a new instrument, is to just see how it reacts in that way. Let's talk about fingerboard geography and how certain notes feel. There are various tactile sensations that help you triangulate the position of a note. Sometimes it's kind of in outer space, which is why we don't like second position so much. It's not home base and it's not quite third position, fourth position, which is kind of a checkpoint. So I like to try to find as many points of reference physically as I can. Because the dimensions of this instrument are different, I'm used to kind of knowing what it means to touch this part of the instrument in various positions. So for me, a fourth position F with second finger on my old violin is this. Let's see how close it is. It's a little bit sharp. So the measurement is a little bit different, and that's something I'll have to get used to. So basically I would tell myself, okay, I'm not really hitting the rib of the instrument. I'm going to be slightly grazing it. And that's how I know that that position is in tune. Another example of this is high up on the A string. So I typically associate this high A with a sensation in the palm touching the edge of the violin here. On this instrument, it happens to be pretty similar, so that's something I would kind of register. Likewise, high up on the G string, I like to have a physical understanding of where A is, so it's pretty similar on this instrument to mine. So you see some measurements might feel the same, some might feel different. So I encourage you to experiment with that. And so there are all kinds of little indicators like that, that if you haven't developed them on any instrument, it's a really good thing to do. Now, finally, about how it looks. This one is a little bit more subtle. I have a visual cue that I can look for from my perspective about where the fingerboard and the wood meet. So if I focus on my right eye and I look at where my finger intersects, it's kind of a B flat. It's a little bit sharp. So on my violin, this is a perfect B flat. It's not bad. I would have to pull it back just a little bit. So now I know that it's just a little more space, not quite at the exact intersection visually with my right eye. I promise this actually works. Likewise, on the E string, to get a perfect E, I look at the same intersection point. So this, on my violin, this is a perfect E. Okay, that's pretty good. So I know if I place that, and sometimes you can't find a note and it has to kind of come from nowhere. I know that I can rely on this to show me where the E is. And that means that I can also find an F reliably and an E flat, because I know the feeling of moving up a whole of a half step. And so I like kind of finding these checkpoints that are a triangulation of how it feels, how it sounds, if you sit on the note as we did, and how it looks. And of course, let's not forget double stops and how we work on double stop intonation. Of course, just diatonic intonation system has us adjusting intervals to line up overtones. So major thirds are lower, minor thirds are higher, and so on. You can find a lot of information about this, but I'll just say that this is a great way to really get to know an instrument. So I would practice really slow scales in thirds. And so this technique of lining up overtones and listening to that beat frequency, that will also change depending on your instrument. So by resensitizing yourself to this way of practicing, you can level up your intonation as you get to know a new instrument. Now, another great exercise for doing this recalibration and getting to know a new instrument is to practice scales in higher positions. Instruments vary in string height and string distance, although that can be adjusted, of course, but it will certainly feel different. And doing something like this can be very helpful. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to get used to the response of the instrument on each string in these higher positions. And in general, practicing scales like this is super useful for really honing in on your intonation. I did a much more in-depth video on this topic covering the Markov scales, so I'll link that in the top right corner. Now let's talk a little bit about shifting. This is going to be a very important way to do your recalibration and to get to know a new instrument. There's a couple of exercises I like for that. One is shifting from the air. So in a normal situation, I might do this preparatory note to find the B. The air shift looks like this. Open, and then shift. This is much harder. I don't have that aural reference. All I have is the physical reference and maybe the visual if I have a trick for that note, but I don't. So this is very important in building your physical sensation of where notes are. So an etude like this Kreutzer would look something like this. Flat. Another one of my favorites is this shifting exercise I came up with, and I think it's a great way to get to know an instrument and also sort of fast track your comfort with the different parts of the fingerboard. So it's an arpeggio exercise where you shift on a single finger and then a different finger, and you go up the different strings. So it looks like this. So this D, I can tell, can't take as much pressure as the other notes. So that's an interesting thing that I'll explore more later as we talk about the right hand. So that's how you go up and down for this exercise. And the cool thing is you could invent any harmony you want. So I just kind of did the triads on A major, but you can do whatever kind of harmonic progression you want. So it's kind of interesting. You can also practice your expressive shifts with this exercise. And I'm treating the shifts as a sort of portamento, not just kind of a mechanical shift. So it's really useful for developing your lyrical playing as well. I go into a bit more depth on this exercise on my Patreon page, so do check that out if you're interested. One other really fun shifting exercise and very useful using a Dante etude from Opus 35. And this video will explain it much better than I can right now. It's actually one of the first videos that I made for my kind of YouTube educational series. So let's talk about the right hand. Obviously, that's kind of the elephant in the room about how instruments will vary. And speaking about sound production first, of course, we have our main components of sound production, our sounding point, our bow speed, and the bow pressure that we exert. Let's go through each one of these, and then I'll give you an exercise that kind of combines them all into one organic feeling. So in terms of pressure, this Stradivarius, it kind of has the best of both worlds. I can exert a lot of pressure on it and it doesn't crack. So that comes in handy, let's say, in pieces like the Violin Concerto No. 5, second movement. And now, of course, another component is our bow speed. So I would practice scales with a whole bow, and that really lets you understand how the instrument sound develops when you use bow speed. Another example is in kind of more light ethereal playing, which is what Stradivari is really known for, this kind of golden sound, especially on the E string. I personally spent a lot of time testing that sort of thing on this violin. So in this passage, I'm testing all sorts of things about the sound production. I'm seeing how the violin responds to a lot of pressure and a lot of speed, right? Can it maintain the focus of the sound? Does it kind of get distracted? Does it fly away? Now, my favorite exercise for really honing in on these elements of sound production, the sounding point, the pressure, the speed, it's something I call the waves. I made a video on this a while ago, And a much better version of that exists on my Patreon. Basically, the idea is that we are integrating those elements into a sort of fluid, patterned motion of the hand and finger. So we're going to make little indentations. Like this. So I'm really testing what the limitations of the instrument are, how it best responds to weight. And the important thing here is to not change the bow speed. It's to only adjust the weight and the sounding point. So not. It's. Physically, you should be able to see kind of the action that you're doing. Make sure the indentations with the index finger are deep, right? Not kind of, not like this, but deep, deep. You could do triple or duple. So all of those are slightly modulating the sound in a way that I might not want. I actually hear the intonation changing. So that's how I know I'm hitting a limit. But in doing this exercise, I'm essentially calibrating the sounding point, the pressure, and getting a feel for the bow speed without treating these kind of like computerized parameters, like a little bit more of this one, a little less of that one. It's kind of an organic exercise that integrates all of these into one. Speaking more about bow technique and how the instrument will respond to different parts of the bow, one exercise I really like is simply doing two slur, two separate bowing. And so on. And you could do one position or you could do 3 octaves. Now the point of this is that we are constantly switching between lower half and upper half for the separate notes. And that lets me zoom in on how the instrument is making sound in these different parts of the bow, because ultimately I want an equality. I want to be able to make the same sound in all parts of the bow. That's how I calibrate my sense of evenness on the instrument. And remember, when you're playing in the lower half of the bow, really activate that upper arm. And in the upper half, really activate the forearm. And so this is also just generally a very good practice, is to continually sharpen your physical sense in these different parts of the bow. If there's a sort of cross-pollination or infection rather, where you're using the forearm in the lower half and kind of going into something like that, it's going to cause problems and it's going to cause confusion. So that kind of clarity is really important. Now, if we bring a lot of these elements together, both in the left hand and in the bow arm, we could talk about chord playing, because the way that the instrument responds to how you break chords and the way that your fingers feel in chord patterns, this will vary significantly from instrument to instrument. And so taking a piece of Bach and really carefully kind of paying attention to these things, as we're about to do, this will really help you get to know an instrument. But also, as the theme of the day is, it's an opportunity to kind of reassess a lot of these foundational technical principles. So in the right hand, by practicing this sarabande from the cello suites, I'm getting a feel for how I can carve through the instrument. How heavy can I land on these chords? This instrument is kind of magical in that regard. As long as I have momentum, I can carve through it with an incredible depth. So that's something you have to figure out for your own instrument. So this gets us into the topic of how to break chords in the first place. And with a new instrument, it's a great idea to break chords differently to see how it reacts. So this first chord, I can do that. I can do. I personally like to break chords in a way that combines double stops but also single notes, so I could really bring out the bass and bring out perhaps a melodic line on the top. And I find that this kind of creates a bit of ambiguity. You know, there's a certain clarity that when you do the 2 and 2 breaking, that kind of clarity to me isn't very attractive for this kind of music. Now, of course, when we play chords, the way that our fingers create these shapes is going to vary greatly from instrument to instrument. I think it's very important to feel different patterns rather than one finger at a time, and kind of coordinating the order in which the fingers move and which fingers are retained, which fingers change. All of these considerations will, of course, make your chord playing more efficient. So the strings on this instrument are a little bit closer together than mine, so that's something I have to contend with. Finally, we can talk about fifths, and of course, every instrument will have a slightly different angle at which fifths ring clearly. So a chord like this, this kind of rotation of the wrist will really help me figure out exactly where that fifth lies. So the trick is to use rotation, use the pattern of fingers, use all of these tools instead of what our natural tendency is, which is to grab the fingerboard. Yeah. So I'm using the wrist. Just a tiny amount of pivoting here makes a huge difference in the intonation. So the combination of good finger placement, which means kind of using the pad of the finger for your fifth, and this kind of adjustment, that's all you need to play fifths perfectly in tune. These are two very important ways to avoid overpressing, because that's the thing I see the most often, is that people kind of acquire these chord shapes by forcing fingers to go there, especially fifths. Like if it's out of tune, I gotta kind of press my way into it. That is totally relieved when you think about the vertical placement. Is the finger here or is it here? Here, here, here. All of these will yield different results, especially in combination. So becoming sensitive to that means that you kind of just place your fingers where they need to go, rather than it being this kind of feat of physical strength.